Okay, so I had another video planned about the new tax being brought in by the Green Party on our energy bills, and that video will be out very soon, but it just felt wrong to release it given recent events. Obviously, the events of Thursday, 22nd of November have really trumped every other news story, and with good reason, including the new record homeless figures which show up yet another government minister as being out of their depth and not up to the task. Thursday was an unbelievably dark day in Irish history for so many reasons. If you just take the events of Thursday afternoon, it would be an incredibly dark day even without everything that followed. 3 young children and their incredibly brave childcare worker who stepped in to protect them, stabbed in broad daylight as school was being let out. It doesn't get much darker and more terrifying than that. As of recording, the 5-year-old girl and the creche worker are still in a critical and serious condition in hospital respectively, and all we can do is hope and pray that they pull through. Thankfully, the other 2 children who were attacked, the 6-year-old girl and the 5-year-old boy, were discharged from hospital. Even as parents of a 5-year-old, neither I nor my husband can even begin to imagine what those parents are going through, and I truly hope that all impacted by this horrific crime are looked after and supported as they try to move on with their lives. I'm sure I was not alone reacting with horror as the news broke. The scale of this crime is truly evil, and as the information trickled out about the victims, it became all the more horrifying. A parent's worst nightmare come to life. And yet, this story was not the one leading the headlines in the days since. The justifiable anger that followed these stabbings led to full-scale rioting on the streets of Dublin City, which the Gardaí struggled to get a handle on for quite some time, and the aftermath of that night of chaos has been the focal point of public discourse since, with very few updates about the conditions of the victims of the stabbings at the heart of the issue. So there's an awful lot to unpack and talk about here. As the news was unfolding about the stabbings, speculation ran rampant about who could have possibly done something so unbelievably vile and evil. Very little information about the perpetrator was released through official channels, which inevitably sent the speculation into overdrive. When it comes to such horrific crimes, I'd argue that it's only natural to want to know who did it and why. Now, in my first video about the topic of immigration, I made a point about perceptions. I said that there are perceptions about how the government look after asylum seekers and refugees here better than the Irish themselves, and that these perceptions can cause a lot of damage if left unchecked, but that it seems that our government are happy to let the tensions simmer based on these perceptions while occasionally fanning the flames themselves, and I gave some examples. And here again, perceptions that have been left unchecked and unchallenged have caused more damage. Anecdotally, there is a perception, rightly or wrongly, that when news of a violent crime is breaking, that if the suspect is Irish, a description is given in the media very quickly, and if no description is forthcoming, then, well, the suspect is not Irish. Now again, rightly or wrongly, that is the perception. I see it quite a lot online. A story is breaking, and if no description is given, the comments and replies start questioning and assuming that the suspect must be foreign. The media cannot pretend to be unaware of this perception, as it is their own stories and posts on social media that attract these responses. And if An Garda Síochána are going to play silly beggars and feign ignorance, then this truly is a catastrophic failure of community policing. Social media is here to stay, and online communities are now part and parcel of our modern life. So yeah, community policing. But I'd wager both the media and An Garda Síochána, and indeed the Department of Justice, are well aware of these perceptions. And yet, they made the decision not to release any information about the suspect until well after the horse had bolted. Worse still was Garda Commissioner Drew Harris having a go at the spread of misinformation. He said, "It's our responsibility to make sure that we police the streets, and part of that is we ask people to act responsibly and not listen to misinformation and rumour that is circulating on social media." Now, that to me is a load of BS. Misinformation can only grow and spread when there is a void of accurate information. It grows to fill that void, and the larger the void, the worse it gets. The authorities who decided to withhold information, which is to say those who lied by omission, otherwise known as misinformation, knew the perceptions and had to know full well what rumours would be spread in that void. The fact that the rumours turned out to be true just added further fuel to the fire. Now, the rioting may well have happened regardless of what information was released, but by withholding that information, the authorities all but guaranteed that the anger would reach a fever pitch in my view. But perhaps maybe actually admitting that it was indeed an Algerian naturalised citizen, when the perception is that such admissions are few and far between, may have caught people off guard. It may have served to deflate some of the anger, perhaps just enough to avoid the scenes, or at least the scale of the scenes, we saw on Thursday night, as people may have seen this admission as an omen that perhaps these issues can now be openly spoken about and not shielded away from public eyes, that perhaps we can talk about immigration and deportation policies. Or maybe I'm just being idealistic again, but either way, the way the public is treated needs to change. We see this in all facets of governance, a lack of transparency and an arrogance and patronising air that those with power and in power know better than the general public and don't have to explain themselves, that such information is too hard for the ordinary citizen to understand, and therefore it's better to avoid worrying their little heads about it. I find this stance repugnant, to be honest. It belittles the public and insults our intelligence, and that is exactly what Drew Harris did with that statement. Transparency surrounding descriptions of violent criminals is a must in my view. It would lead to more trust in the authorities and could open the door to mature conversations about crime and crime demographics in general. The public cannot be treated as children who are too uneducated or immature to have this knowledge and have these conversations. Crime is ugly. It's easy to want to hide it away, but to really tackle it, we must rip off the bandage and examine the root causes in all its gory detail. And that leads me on to the riots themselves. It's easy to dismiss the perpetrators of the rioting, looting and destruction as nothing more than the far right running wild. Indeed, that is exactly the stance the government and the Garda Commissioner are taking. But that is an easy scapegoat, in my opinion. A scapegoat, incidentally, that is quite convenient and helpful to the government and their own aims, but more on that later. From what I saw from the multitude of videos circulating on Thursday evening, the mob had various different elements at play and came from various different demographics. The obvious far-right influence was there, of course, and I am certainly not downplaying their role in this, far from it, but there was more than just that there, and to imply that the far-right was the only element at play is reductive and unhelpful. There were the opportunists and also the criminal element that just sought to profit from the chaos. But there were also the disenfranchised raging at the machine who have left them behind and ignored them over successive generations. It goes without saying that I absolutely condemn the looting and destruction that we witnessed on Thursday night. There is no political statement to be made by looting Arnott's or setting fire to a bus. Such actions only play into the hands of a government struggling to control the narrative. But I can understand the anger. If the news of the stabbings of 3 very young children and their heroic childcare worker does not make you angry, then what would it take? And when that anger is added to communities who already feel anger at being ignored, forgotten, and even vilified for raising concerns, coupled with an opportunistic far-right element seeking to take advantage of that sentiment, well, it doesn't take a genius to see where this was headed. Indeed, the warning signs were clearly visible all over social media. I'm a tiny Twitter user by anyone's standards, and even I was seeing tweets both condemning and encouraging the orchestrating of the riots. If I could see it with my tiny presence on Twitter, then so could everyone else, including, An Garda Síochána and the Department of Justice, and yet they feigned ignorance yet again, with Drew Harris saying that no one could have predicted the riots. Now perhaps they were hoping it would all blow over, and that those agitating on social media were full of hot air and nothing more, but everyone else could see that tensions have been simmering for quite some time, and the stabbing of young children was going to be the trigger for everything to boil over. And so it did. And the response from An Garda Síochána was nothing short of disastrous. Heads should roll for it. It was a catastrophic failure of policing and highlighted just how poorly run and funded our police service is. Rank and file uniformed Gardaí were sent out in 2s and 3s to attempt to counteract what was unfolding. Everyone and their grannies could see that there was no earthly way those Gardaí were going to be able to stifle the chaos that was erupting. And yet they were sent out to bear the brunt and face attacks by mobs. They were nothing more than scapegoats for the rioters. That is unforgivable. Riot police should have been mobilised far earlier in the day in anticipation of the potential violence and unrest that the rest of us could see coming. But of course, they weren't. That would be too proactive for anything in Ireland, wouldn't it? No, instead they sent out ordinary members of An Garda Síochána to face insurmountable anger with no backup. It's a miracle none were seriously injured or worse. Instead of being proactive, they allowed Dublin City to be overrun. They allowed Dublin City to burn. If anyone can explain to me how Justice Minister Helen McEntee and Garda Commissioner Drew Harris can claim that their positions are tenable, please do, because I am stumped. What we witnessed on Thursday night was the chronic failures of our policing and judicial systems coming home to roost. Fine Gael, the party of law and order, have succeeded in making the job of a guard unpalatable and unenticing, leading to an exodus from the force. They have allowed criminal elements to gain a foothold across the country, with an underfunded policing service unable to do anything about it. They have not bothered to explore why deprived areas turn to crime. Instead, they ignore those areas and add to the poverty, thus pushing more towards crime. They ignore the concerns of rank-and-file Gardaí and instead have made targets of those rank-and-file officers by sending them to help with evictions and to guard the private property of banks. They should be ashamed of themselves. But of course, they won't be. They'll carry on their merry way, blaming the easy target while ignoring the wider issues and abdicating any and all blame. It's very easy to simply blame the far right, and make no mistake, there absolutely was a far right element at play and they should be severely dealt with. But the government need to own up to their own failures here. An ever-increasing wealth divide pushing impoverished communities even further into poverty and neglect is the absolute perfect conditions needed for people to turn to crime, and as we saw on Thursday night, for their rage against the establishment that left them behind to be exploited by the far right. The government wants to stop the far right from growing here in Ireland? Then stop ignoring the social and economic issues that caused their rise in the first place. Stop vilifying communities for asking questions and for protesting peacefully in the first instance. Stop patronising people. Take responsibility for just writing off the most deprived areas of the country while simultaneously degrading the policing service. And stop calling everything far right. When everything is labelled as far right, then nothing is. And that label is really starting to lose all meaning in my view. And that just lets the true far right hide in plain sight and get away with it. This is not an easy issue to solve, and it can't be solved overnight, and there will always be a criminal element in our world that no amount of targeted interventions can avoid, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. I've spoken before about how Finland have successfully tackled homelessness. They didn't do it by shying away from the problems and causes, no matter how uncomfortable it made them feel or how hopeless it may have seemed. They did it by facing it head on and working hard with targeted interventions over many years. And now they are seeing the fruits of their labour, and their corner of the world is better for it. That attitude can be applied to any issue, and that's what needs to happen here. But ultimately, the will needs to be there, and as we well know in Ireland, the only will we ever see from Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil is to find a quick fix to save their own skins that won't require any real work, no matter how much worse it ends up making the situation. And that's what we're seeing here. Instead of addressing the issues in policing and tackling crime, we are seeing them forge ahead with their own agendas. We are seeing them push the new hate speech bill while claiming that it's needed so they can deal with those who incited the riots. Except that's not really true now, is it? A little over 2 months ago, a man was charged with incitement to hatred with online posts about refugees and will face trial. So tell me, what laws need to be changed exactly if we can already charge people with incitement to hatred in an online space? Now, I've covered the hate speech bill previously on this channel, and I'd urge you to check out that video for why this new proposed legislation is so worrying and Orwellian. The link will be at the end of this video and in the description below. Thursday, 22nd of November, was a watershed moment in showing us all just how ineffective our policing service is. It was the catastrophic failure we all feared, a total breakdown of law and order on the streets of our capital for the world to see. Within a few hours, a disorganised group had taken over the city. But it doesn't stop there. The perpetrator of the vile crimes that set the day in motion was actually before the courts only a few short months ago on knife charges, according to the Mirror, but no order was made and he was let go free. A no-order decision is usually made when a judge rules that there is a significant mental health aspect to the case. So 2 catastrophic failures there, one in the realm of justice and the other in the realm of provision of mental health services. Unforgivable. In the days since, there has been more violence, with reports of another bus being set alight and even more knife crime, with a man being slashed with a machete. And yet still, Helen McEntee is Minister for Justice and Drew Harris is Garda Commissioner. How many more failures do we need to see before they do the decent thing and admit they are out of their depths? And how about this for another failure? On Tuesday, 28th of November, there was no Garda presence at all outside the school where the stabbings occurred just days earlier. Terrified parents went to collect their children at 2:30 and not a single guard was to be seen. Absolutely shameful. Those parents and their children just abandoned by the state. Not even a pretense of care given. Disgraceful. And yet McEntee and Harris remain. It beggars belief. Now, this is normally where I sign off and ask what you think. What were your views on the riot, the Garda response and the fallout since? And I do want to hear your views in the comments below, but I'd like to sign off instead by bringing the focus back firstly to the child and childcare worker who are still in hospital, as their well-being should be on everyone's mind right now. All we can do is stay positive and hope they pull through, and that the other children involved, and indeed their parents, are resilient and can put this horrible ordeal behind them. And on the note of positivity, let's end by focusing on the positives, because quite frankly we need it. Let's focus on the good in the world, the heroes of that day, the first responders, the doctors and nurses who are still working tirelessly to care for the injured, the 3 men who valiantly jumped in to take down the attacker intent on the murder of the most innocent of our society, deserve all the plaudits and more. Leanne Flynn, the creche worker who collected the children and was the first to step in and protect those children by throwing herself between them and the knife-wielding maniac. What a woman. What an absolute hero she is. And finally, I want to bring attention to little Abigail, the 11-year-old autistic girl in town for her birthday, whose dad Warren was one of the 3 heroes who jumped into the fray, because I don't think her story has gotten the attention it deserves. While her dad was bravely tackling the attacker, Abigail ran straight to the Rotunda Hospital, shouting for help the entire way, and alerted the staff and doctors there to what was happening. What an amazing young woman she is. Her courage and quick thinking helped to save lives that day. What a hero. There is still good in this world, even if sometimes it's hard to see it. Anyway, you know the drill by now. Like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to be notified of new content. If you want to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee or a super thanks, which is greatly appreciated, and a huge thank you to those of you that already have. You can also follow me on Twitter. Until next time, slán go fóill.